Welcome back to my channel, where we uncover the forgotten corners of the past. Today, I'm taking you into a story about the cannibal clan that lived in the woods and hunted travelers in 1852 Michigan that you might have never heard before. A mystery buried in the dust of time, a truth that will send shivers down your spine. But before we embark on this journey, take a moment to let me know where are you listening to this story from. That helps me understand how far these secrets have traveled. And if this story truly captivates you, if it makes you ponder, don't hesitate to give me a like and subscribe to the channel to keep me going. Together, we'll explore the darkest pages of history, and you won't want to miss a thing. The scream echoed through Michigan's virgin timber for exactly 3 seconds before the forest swallowed it whole. It was not a sound of simple fear, but of profound, final violation, a tearing of the veil between the known world and something anciently, terribly other. Then, silence. A silence so absolute it seemed to possess a weight of its own, pressing down upon the ancient pines, the damp earth, and the very air itself. By dawn, when the first rays of sunlight struggled to pierce the dense canopy, only Thomas Hartwell's empty logging cart remained. It stood abandoned on the muddy track, a stark monument to a life interrupted. Hartwell was a man of routine and quiet competence, a man who knew the forest's moods better than he knew the faces of his distant relatives. He navigated its treacherous paths, not with arrogance, but with a deep, abiding respect. He understood that the wilderness demanded caution. On this morning, however, caution had not been enough. His oxen, still hitched to the cart, were the sole living witnesses. They trembled uncontrollably, their flanks slick with sweat and foam despite the morning chill. Their eyes, wide and white-rimmed, were fixed on the impenetrable wall of trees from which they had just fled. They held a look of pure dour, animal terror, a reflection of things no creature should ever witness, a horror that had burned away every instinct save for the paralyzed need to stand still. When the search party from Maple Ridge finally found them hours later, Deputy Marshal James Crawford, a man who had seen his share of hardship, felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He'd seen oxen spooked by lightning, bears, even the occasional cougar. But this was different. This was a fear so profound it had broken their spirit. This is the story of what lurked in America's untamed wilderness, at a time when civilization was still a fragile line drawn in dirt and hope, a line that was about to be erased. The year was 1852, and Michigan was a land built on paradox, a crucible of breathtaking beauty and brutal hardship. The great lumber boom was in full swing, a force of nature in itself, transforming the state into a promised land for the ambitious and a last resort for the desperate. Men from across the nation and from the old countries poured into the territory. Drawn by the siren song of green gold, they were men with calloused hands and hollow-eyed determination, willing to trade their safety and their pasts for a chance at a future built from the colossal white pines. These were the giants that had stood since before Columbus set sail, their trunks so wide it would take 3 men with outstretched arms to encircle one. The loggers, or shanty boys as they were called, lived in isolated camps, rough-hewn communities that sprouted like fungi in the deep woods. Their world was an assault on the senses, the constant, deafening ring of steel biting into wood, the thunderous crash of a falling giant that shook the very earth, the sharp, clean scent of pine sap that clung to their clothes and skin, a perfume that could never quite mask the underlying odor of sweat, unwashed bodies, and simmering despair. The forest canopy was a perpetual twilight, a green and black ceiling that seemed to absorb both light and sound, creating a claustrophobic sense of isolation. Here, a man could work for weeks alongside 50 others and still feel utterly, terrifyingly alone. But this land also held memories, scars from winters so brutal they were spoken of only in hushed tones, like ghost stories told around a dying fire. The winter of 1848 to 49 especially was a name that carried a particular weight. It was a winter of legend, a season when the snow fell for 6 straight weeks, burying the world in a shroud of white. Entire camps were swallowed whole, their crude cabins transformed into silent, frozen tombs. When the thaw finally came, rescue parties found scenes of unimaginable tragedy. They found camps where men sat frozen at their dinner tables, forks still in hand. They found others who had simply walked out into the blizzard, choosing a quick death in the snow over a slow one by starvation. But some camps, the records noted, had simply vanished. No bodies, no signs of struggle, just an unsettling emptiness where a community of hard-working men had once been. The forest, with its promise of wealth, was also a place of profound and terrible hunger. It was a place that knew how to keep its secrets. It was into this world of desperate hope and shadowed history that men like Thomas Hartwell carved their existence. He was a vital artery in this sprawling, chaotic enterprise. But 3 weeks after his cart was found, another followed. The Morrison brothers, twins known for their immense size and fiery tempers, men who claimed to fear neither God nor beast, disappeared on the same route. Their cart was found with a half-eaten lunch sitting on the driver's seat, an apple with a single, crisp bite taken out of it. The sight was eerily peaceful, yet a peculiar odor hung in the air. It was a sweet, cloying smell, sickly and nauseating, like meat left too long in the sun. Again, searchers were mounted. The men of Maple Ridge and in the surrounding camps combed the woods for days, their calls echoing unanswered through the trees. They found nothing. No tracks, no blood. It was as if the very land had consumed them. It was then that the whispers began. They started quietly, in the hushed conversations after a long day's work, over tin cups of bitter coffee, loggers and trappers. Men who read the forest like a book started reporting things that didn't fit. They spoke of strange, greasy smokes rising from deep, inaccessible valleys where no settlements existed. Smokes that smelled wrong, carrying a scent that made the stomach turn. They told of stumbling upon crude shelters, not built by any logging outfit they knew, constructed from bark, mud, and something that looked disturbingly like bone, woven into the walls as if for decoration. The fire pits in these abandoned camps were the worst, filled with charred remains that were too small, too fragmented to be from any known game animal. And then there were the tracks. The most credible account came from a seasoned Finnish logger named Elias Korhonen, a man known for his quiet demeanor and sharp eyes. He had been checking his trap lines near Dead Man's Creek when he found them pressed into the soft earth. He reported it later at the Maple Ridge General Store, his voice low and strained with a fear that silenced the room. "Bare feet," he said, his thick accent making the words sound even more alien. But wrong. Somehow, the heel was deep, but the foot was too wide, and the toes were too long, like a digging animal's. He took a shaky breath and stared into the faces of the men around him. "And sometimes," he whispered, making the sign of the cross on his chest, "sometimes they walk on all fours." These stories were, at first, dismissed by the more practical townsfolk as the wild imaginings of men who spent too much time alone, their minds addled by isolation and cheap whiskey. But as the number of missing persons climbed from 2 to 5, and then to 7, the fear became a palpable entity. It crept into the town of Maple Ridge, a low-grade fever that no one could shake. This fear was what finally landed on the desk of Constable William Hayes. He was a practical man, a former soldier not given to flights of fancy, a man who believed in clear facts and logical conclusions. He meticulously documented each disappearance, interviewed the witnesses, and mapped the locations. He saw a pattern emerging, a terrifying, methodical intelligence that chilled him to the bone. In his office, surrounded by maps and witness statements, he felt the fragile shell of his civilized world begin to crack. The stories of strange tracks and bone shelters no longer seemed so fanciful. He was a man of the law. But what law applied here? This was something older, something that operated by a set of rules he could not comprehend. With a growing sense of dread, he penned his official report to the territorial governor in Detroit. He wrote, "We have now recorded 7 missing persons along the northern logging routes. No bodies recovered. Searched quadrants show evidence of unknown habitation. I must stress that this does not appear to be the work of local tribes, with whom we have peaceful relations. The evidence points to something else entirely." He dipped his pen again, the scratching sound loud in the quiet room. "Request additional men and authorization to expand investigation into unmapped territories. The situation is becoming untenable." That letter, a desperate plea for order and reason against a rising tide of primal chaos, would never be answered, because on the very night Constable Hayes sealed it with wax, the unseen threat decided it had hidden long enough. It was no longer content to merely hunt the solitary travelers in the deep woods. It was moving closer, drawn by the firelight and the fragile heartbeat of civilization. The letter on Constable William Hayes's desk lay unfinished, the ink still glisteningly wet under the solitary lamplight. It was a plea, a desperate bridge of words cast out towards a distant authority he suddenly, instinctively, knew would never arrive in time. Outside his small, meticulously kept cabin at the edge of Maple Ridge, the night was unnervingly still. The usual chorus of crickets and katydids had fallen silent, and the wind, which typically whispered secrets through the pines, now held its breath. Hayes was a man of logic, a man forged in the brutal pragmatism of the Mexican War, a man who believed that for every effect there was a tangible cause, but the cause of this suffocating silence was something his training had never prepared him for. He felt it not as a sound, but as a pressure against the very walls of his home, a focused, malevolent attention, a soft, scraping sound, like a branch being dragged across the roof shingles, made him freeze. It stopped. Then, a heavier sound, a soft thud against the back wall. He rose from his chair, his heart a cold, heavy drum in his chest, his hand instinctively going to the Colt revolver holstered at his hip. He didn't know that his next action would be the final, official act of law in the town of Maple Ridge. He knew only that the fragile line he was meant to defend was about to be irrevocably broken. The following morning, it was Mayor Edmund Cray and the town blacksmith, Samuel Brennan, who made the discovery. Their conversation on the short walk to the cabin had been tense, filled with the denial that was wearing thin. Perhaps he took an early patrol, Edmund, Brennan had offered, his voice lacking its usual booming conviction. The mayor had only nodded, his own hope a flickering candle against a rising wind. What they found was not a scene of violence, but one of profound and terrifying stillness that mocked their feeble optimism. The cabin door was ajar, swinging gently in the morning breeze, a silent invitation into a desecrated space. Inside, the cabin was immaculate. A pot of coffee sat on the stove, its contents still warm enough to send a faint, ghostly wisp of steam into the cool air. A half-eaten breakfast of bacon and eggs rested on the table. The fork laid neatly beside the plate as if the constable had been interrupted mid-bite by a visitor he knew. There was no sign of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no splatter of blood. William Hayes had simply been erased from the very heart of his own ordered world. The news spread through Maple Ridge not like a wildfire, but like a frost, silently and invisibly freezing the heart of the community. The disappearance of loggers in the deep woods was a tragedy rooted in the known dangers of their trade. The vanishing of the town's sole lawman from his own home was an outright declaration of war. It was an act of audacious, predatory contempt, a statement that the flimsy constructs of civilization, its laws, its badges, its locked doors were a meaningless joke. The terror was no longer a distant whisper from the logging camps. It now sat on their doorsteps, an invisible guest at every breakfast table, a silent observer in every darkened window. The men grew quiet and grim, their hands checking and rechecking rifles that hadn't been fired in years. The women pulled their children closer, their eyes constantly scanning the dark, unblinking line of trees that bordered their small lives. The wilderness was no longer a source of sustenance and wealth. It had become the wall of a cage. And they were just now beginning to realize they were trapped inside. This collective, unspoken dread forced Mayor Cray's hand. An emergency town meeting was called at high noon, the only time of the day when the shadows were short and the darkness felt, however briefly, held at bay. The Lutheran church, the largest and most solid building in town, was filled to capacity. Its 237 souls packed tightly into the wooden pews. The air inside was thick and suffocating, a potent mixture of unwashed bodies, wet wool, fierce sweat, and the lingering, ever-present scent of wood smoke that seemed to cling to everyone now like a funeral shroud. A baby cried near the front, a thin, piercing sound, before being quickly muffled by its mother's hand. Outside, an unnerving October wind rattled the window panes, its mournful howl a constant, mocking reminder of the vast, untamed world that lay waiting just beyond the thin glass. Panic, barely controlled, began to bubble to the surface, manifesting as anger and blame. "We must send word to Detroit," declared Margaret Olson, the schoolma'am whose sharp, commanding voice could normally silence a room of unruly children. Now, it trembled with an uncharacteristic desperation. The territorial militia must be summoned. Detroit is a 4-day ride by horseback. Margaret, assuming the rider even makes it through that cursed forest, retorted Samuel Brennan from the back. The blacksmith's massive frame, usually a symbol of the town's strength, now seemed to signify only its powerlessness. His voice was a low rumble of pragmatic despair. How many more of us will vanish while we wait for a help that may never come? We are on our own. Mayor Cray stood at the makeshift podium, his usual commanding presence diminished, his face etched with the strain of a man trying to steer a ship through a hurricane without a rudder or a map. "We have the 8 confirmed disappearances in 6 weeks, he announced, his voice heavy, the words falling like stones into the tense silence. "The latest being our own constable, whatever is out there." He paused, searching for words that could make sense of the senseless. "It's organized, it's patient, and it is getting bolder." The crowd murmured in frightened agreement, a low, guttural sound of shared terror. Voices rose in a chaotic cacophony of fear and accusation. Some argued for a mass exodus, for abandoning the homes they had bled and sweat to build. Others, proud and stubborn, spoke of forming a militia, of hunting down whatever man or beast was responsible. But beneath the bluster and the panicked debate lay a darker, more insidious truth that no one dared to speak aloud. The merchant eyed the trapper. The farmer eyed the blacksmith. A grim, unspoken calculus of survival had begun in the quiet corners of their minds. They were already making lists, weighing the value of their neighbors, wondering who among them was essential and who was expendable. It was into this maelstrom of fear that a new voice emerged, calm and measured. Doctor. Nathaniel Foster rose from a back pew, his leather medical bag clutched against his chest like a shield. The town's physician was a man of science, an import from Boston who preferred observation to speculation, facts to folklore. All eyes turned to him, this quiet intellectual who always seemed to stand slightly apart from the town's rough-hewn society. His voice cut cleanly through the noise. I examined the Morrison camp before the search parties disturbed everything, he stated, his tone clinical, precise, stripping the emotion from a scene of horror. I found something they missed. A profound silence fell over the church, a silence born of desperate hope and chilling anticipation. The only sound was the creak of the floorboards as Dr. Foster walked to the front, his steps deliberate and heavy. He reached into his coat, his movements slow, adding to the unbearable tension, and produced a small object wrapped in the square of clean linen. The air grew thick with expectation. Every eye was locked on the small bundle in his hands, as if it were the holy sacrament itself, with the care of a surgeon revealing a diagnosis. Foster unwrapped the crude implement. The collective gasp of the congregation was a single, unified sound of horror. Margaret Olson brought a hand to her mouth. Samuel Brennan's fists clenched at his sides until his knuckles turned white. There, resting in the doctor's palm, gleaming dully in the light filtering through the church windows, was a tool. It had been carved from bone, unmistakably human bone, from the thick, strong shaft of a femur. It was sharpened to a wicked, piercing point at one end, the other end polished smooth by the grip of a hand, or many hands, over a long period of time. It was a thing of grotesque, pragmatic craftsmanship, a profane object brought into a sacred space. "This is not the work of any animal," Foster said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the silent room. The striations and polish are signs of deliberate manufacture, nor is it a tool of any known tribe in this territory. Their craftsmanship is far more refined. He held it up for all to see, and it was then that they noticed the marks along its length. A series of tiny, precise notches had been carved into the bone. They were organized in groups of 5, with a diagonal line through each group of 4, a chillingly familiar system of accounting. A tally. "I have counted them," Foster continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was somehow more terrifying than a shout, forcing everyone to lean in. "There are 37. He didn't need to finish the sentence. 37 souls, 37 men, husbands, fathers, and sons, reduced to a scratch on a human bone. The whispers and rumors of the past weeks solidified into a monstrous, undeniable truth. They were not being haunted by a ghost or stalked by a beast. They were being farmed, systematically. But the doctor was not finished. The silence in the church deepened, becoming heavier, more suffocating, as he prepared to deliver his final, most disturbing finding. His face was pale, his scientific composure beginning to crack. "There is something else," he said, his medical professionalism warring with the sheer revulsion in his eyes. "I found impressions in the bark of the trees around their camp. Bite marks." He paused, letting the weight of the word hang in the air before delivering the truly unthinkable detail. Human bite marks. But the jaw structure, it's wrong. He shook his head slowly, as if trying to dislodge an image burned into his mind. Based on the dental arch, the mandible is significantly wider than that of a normal man. And the teeth? The impressions show they have been filed to points. The abrasions are methodical, not random breakage. They were shaped, deliberately. The image this conjured was beyond comprehension. It shattered the last vestiges of denial within the room. This was not about wild men or escaped convicts. This was something else. Something that had once been human, but had been twisted by some unspeakable alchemy of the deep woods, by hunger and isolation and madness, into a new and terrifying form of predator. The arguments over whether to stay or to flee died in their throats, replaced by a single paralyzing realization that settled over them like a physical weight. They were not on the border of civilization anymore. They were trapped in a cage. And the thing on the other side of the bars was intelligent, patient, and it was looking in. The silence that followed Dr. Foster's revelation was a living entity. It was heavier than the great timbers that formed the church's rafters, more profound than the shared faith that had once filled this space. It was a silence of shattered paradigms, the sound of 237 minds simultaneously grappling with a truth too monstrous to absorb. The world they had known, a world of hardship, yes, but one governed by the understandable laws of man and nature, had ceased to exist. In its place was a primeval nightmare, given shape and form by the cold. Clinical words of their physician. They were not settlers on a new frontier. They were livestock in a pen. And the thing on the other side of the fence was intelligent, patient, and it had been studying them. It was into this vacuum of horrified paralysis that a new sound erupted, not from within the church, but from the world outside. It was a voice, high and desperate, a raw, ragged shriek that tore through the heavy afternoon air. "Help, dear God! Someone help me!" The spell was broken. Chaos erupted as the congregation scrambled from the pews, their own fear momentarily forgotten in the face of this new, urgent drama. They rushed to the windows and threw open the heavy doors, their eyes squinting against the daylight. There, stumbling into the muddy expanse of the town square, was a figure that seemed more apparition than man. He was skeletal, his clothes torn to bloody rags that hung from a frame shockingly depleted of its former substance. He moved with a lurching, uncoordinated gait, his legs threatening to buckle with every step, as if his mind and body were no longer in agreement. He was a scarecrow of a man, animated only by a final, desperate surge of adrenaline. As he collapsed into the muck of the street, the townspeople pressed closer, a circle of morbid curiosity and dawning horror. It was Macabre and Dr. Foster who reached him first, their boots sinking into the mud beside his shaking form. It was only then, as they knelt beside him, that they recognized the face beneath the grime and the gaunt, stretched skin. The recognition hit them like a physical blow. It was Jacob Winters, a trapper and woodsman who had vanished along the northern route more than 3 weeks earlier, a man they had all presumed dead. Another tally mark on a bone tool. Now, he was back from a place none of them could imagine. "Jacob, my God, man, where have you been?" Gray asked, his voice thick with disbelief. "What happened to you?" Winters looked up, and the eyes that met the mayor's were ancient, hollowed out things that had seen too much. They were the eyes of a man who had stared into the abyss and had found the abyss staring back. When he opened his mouth to speak, the crowd gasped. Several of his front teeth were missing, leaving black, ragged gaps in his mouth. They kept me," he whispered, his voice a dry, rattling rasp. He began to shiver violently, though the October day was mild. Fed me. Things. Made me watch. His voice broke, dissolving into a dry sob that shook his entire body. Oh, God, the sounds. The sounds they make when they're eating. While the crowd waited in horrified silence, Dr. Foster, his mind shifting immediately into a clinical mode, began to examine Winters's visible wounds. The trapper's arms and shoulders were covered in marks. They were bite marks, just as Foster had theorized from the trees. But these were on human flesh. They were deep, precise, almost surgical in their application, arranged in patterns that suggested a chilling and repeated intimacy. Some were old and scabbed over. Others were new and raw, oozing a sickly fluid. They were not the marks of a frenzied attack, but the methodical work of a butcher marking a piece of meat. "Shh, Jacob," Foster said gently, his voice a low anchor in the swirling sea of panic. "Who kept you where?" Winter's shaking hand shot out and grabbed the doctor's coat with a surprising, desperate strength. His eyes darted around at the circle of faces pressing in on him, as if seeing them for the first time. "Not who?" he hissed, his voice gaining a terrifying clarity. "What? They ain't people anymore. There's something else. Something that was people once, maybe." He struggled to sit up, his gaze fixing on the dark, impenetrable wall of the forest that surrounded their town. A single trembling finger rose and pointed towards the tree line. "They're coming. Tonight, they said they were tired of hunting one by one." He looked directly at Mayor Cray, his eyes pleading. "They're already watching." Every head in the square snapped towards the forest, and for a moment, the only sound was the wind sighing through the pines. Then, someone screamed. In the deep shadows between the ancient trees, barely visible against the dark bark, pale shapes moved with an unnatural stillness. How many were there? 10, 20. How many pairs of hungry eyes were watching them right now, calculating which houses had the strongest doors, which families huddled closest together, and which children would make the least noise? The illusion of safety was gone. The cage had no bars. The forest itself was the cage. As the sun began its slow, merciless descent, casting long, grasping shadows across Maple Ridge, the townspeople retreated into their homes, the sounds of hammers on wood echoing through the twilight as they boarded up their windows. But they knew, in their hearts, that it was a futile gesture inside Dr. Foster's clinic, which had been transformed into a makeshift command center and infirmary. The truth of their situation finally began to spill out, like blood from a wound that refused to clot. The lanterns burned like desperate prayers against the gathering darkness, their yellow light barely penetrating the October gloom that wrapped around Maple Ridge like a burial shroud. The smell of carbolic acid mixed with the sweet, foul stench of infection that seemed to radiate from Jacob Winters's very pores, while Foster cleaned the infected bite wounds with a grim focus. Mayor Cray took notes, his normally steady, authoritative handwriting reduced to a barely legible scrawl. "Start from the beginning, Jacob," Cray said, his voice betraying a deep reluctance to hear the truth he knew was coming. "What happened after you left town 3 weeks ago?" Winters stared at his hands, at the alien thinness of his fingers. "I was checking my trap line near Dead Man's Creek. Been trapping these woods since I was 12. I know every sound, every shadow." He touched the back of his skull gingerly. "Something hit me from behind. Didn't see it, didn't hear it. The world just went black." He looked from Cray to Foster, his eyes holding a haunted, distant quality. I woke up in a place that ain't on any map, a hollow, deep in the forest, where the trees grow so thick and tall you can't see the sky. Not ever. It's always twilight there. Doctor! Foster paused his ministrations, his hands hovering over a particularly deep wound on Winter's shoulder. What kind of place? Shelters ain't the right word for what they built. Nests, layers, Winters rasped, made from logs and mud and... His voice cracked, and he swallowed hard before continuing. And bones, human bones, woven through the walls like they were decorations. Rib cages forming windows, skulls staring down from the roofs. It was a town built from the dead. The scratching of Cray's pen stopped. How many of them were there? Jacob? Hard to say. They moved different than people. Sometimes on two legs, all hunched over. Sometimes on all fours, fast as a wolf. I seen maybe 8 or 10 distinct ones, but there could have been more. They'd come and go from the hollow, always hunting. Winters rolled up his torn sleeve, revealing a series of precise, shallow cuts along his forearm, arranged in neat rows. They mocked me, each day. Another cut, like they were seasoning me. Foster's medical training warred with his human revulsion as he examined the cuts. Each one was identical in depth and length, made with a sharp, steady hand. This was not random violence. This was methodical, ritualistic preparation. They've been watching this town for months, Winters continued, his voice flat with exhaustion. They got a system. They know who travels alone, which routes see the least traffic, what time the logging crews change shifts. He looked directly at Mayor Cray, and his next words turned the mayor's blood to ice. They know you, Edmund, know your wife's name, know she waters her garden every morning at 8 o'clock. The mayor's face went ashen. What do they want? Same thing any predator wants, Winters said grimly. Food, territory, but it's more than that. He stood and walked to the clinic window, peering through a small gap in the hastily installed boards. They weren't always like this. The room grew colder. They started as a family, loggers, came up from Ohio in '48 for the big boom. The Murdoch clan, father, mother, 3 sons, 2 daughters. Foster and Cray exchanged a look of dawning horror. They remembered the stories of that winter, the one that had wiped so many camps from existence. They got caught in the early blizzard. Winters confirmed their unspoken fear. Snowed in for 4 months. No supplies. Shh. Dear God, Foster whispered. The Murdoch clan didn't freeze, Winters said, his voice a dead monotone. They found another way to survive. Started with their pack animals. Then the father died, or was made to die. It gets easier, you see, once you've crossed that line once. Crossing it again is like stepping over a crack in the dirt. He swallowed hard, his throat working. By the time the thaw came, only 2 were left. The eldest son, Caleb, and his sister, Ruth. They'd consumed the rest of their family. But it changed them, he continued, turning from the window, his face a grave mask. Not just their minds, their bodies, living on human flesh for months, never seeing sunlight, always cold, always hungry. Something inside them broke that couldn't be fixed. When spring came, they didn't rejoin civilization. They went deeper into the woods, and they started hunting. Winter's gaze was intense, burning with a terrible knowledge. That was 4 years ago. They've been adding to their family ever since. Taking people, keeping the strong ones alive long enough to make the change, breaking them down in the dark, feeding them things, until there's nothing human left inside. They don't just kill, Edmund. They recruit. His story, a confession delivered on behalf of the damned, hung in the air, thick and poisonous. And then, a new sound broke the silence. A dog began barking frantically somewhere in the town. A sound of pure panic that was abruptly, horribly, choked off. The silence that followed felt pregnant with menace. A silence that could only mean one thing. "They're here," Winters whispered, backing away from the window. He grabbed Gray's arm with desperate strength. "You have to understand. They don't just kill. Tonight, they're not just here to eat. They're here to grow." A scraping sound echoed from the roof directly above them. The unmistakable sound of claws dragging across wooden shingles. Then another, and another. Low growling, guttural and hungry, vibrated through the ceiling. And then, a sound that might have been laughter, if laughter could sound like grinding stones and insatiable hunger. The three men stood frozen in the lamplight, three pillars of a civilization on the verge of collapse. As the monsters they had only just begun to understand started walking across their roof, they moved with the patience of spiders, waiting for the flies trapped in their web to tire themselves out, to give up struggling, to accept the inevitable. "Doctor," Foster moved first, his scientific mind overriding his terror. He grabbed his medical bag and motioned the others toward the back room where he kept his surgical instruments. The floorboards creaked under their weight, each sound magnified in the oppressive quiet. "The back door," Foster whispered, leading them through a cramped storage room filled with the conflicting smells of antiseptic and dried herbs. "It opens onto the alley behind Brennan's smithy." Mayor Gray clutched his notebook of Winter's testimony against his chest like a holy relic. The last record of a world that was about to end. "We have to warn the others." "With what?" Winters hissed, his voice a venomous whisper. "Ring the church bell and bring them all running towards us. These things hunt in packs. Edmund, they've probably surrounded the whole damn town by now. That's their way." A soft scratching resumed overhead, moving from the front of the building toward the back with a terrifying, deliberate purpose. Whatever was up there had heard them. It was following their movements, room by room. Foster reached for the back door handle, then froze. Through the narrow window set in the door, a pale face stared back at them, its breath fogging the cool glass. The features were recognizably human in their arrangement, but hideously wrong in their proportion. The jaw was too wide, the eye sockets too deep and shadowed, and when it smiled, a set of filed, pointed teeth gleamed in the lamplight like shards of broken glass. The thing on the other side of the glass raised one long, unnaturally thin finger to its lips in a sickening mockery of silence. Then it pointed with its other hand towards the front of the building, as if responding to a silent signal. A fraction of a second later, the clinic's front door exploded inward with a crash of splintered pine that shook the entire structure. "They hunt like wolves." The thought screamed through Cray's mind, one to distract, the others to flank. "The cellar," Foster gasped, pulling up a trapdoor that had been hidden beneath a heavy medical cabinet. "It connects to the church basement through an old drainage tunnel." The three men scrambled down the rough wooden steps into the musty darkness just as something impossibly large and heavy crashed through the clinic's main room above. Glass shattered, furniture splintered, and underneath it all came a sound that chilled them to the bone, the sound of rhythmic, deep, hungry breathing, like a great predator savoring the scent of cornered prey from their hiding place. They heard the intruders moving through the clinic with methodical precision, searching, testing, learning the layout. One of them spoke in that broken guttural pidgin Winters had described. Gone. Down ground. A voice rasped, followed by others responding in similar fragmented speech. Follow scent. Find. Holds. The heavy cellar door above them thudded, then splintered as something began to tear it apart. The repercussion for learning the truth had been swift and absolute. There would be no trial, no justice. There was only the hunt and the long dark tunnel ahead. The scream echoed through Michigan's virgin timber for exactly 3 seconds before the forest swallowed it whole. By dawn, only Thomas Hartwell's empty logging cart remained. Its oxen, still hitched, trembled with wide, white-rimmed eyes and animal terror that spoke of things no creature should witness. This is the story of what lurked in America's untamed wilderness, at a time when civilization was still a fragile line drawn in dirt and hope. The year was 1852, and the Michigan lumber boom was a force of nature. It drew desperate men into vast, ancient forests where the canopy was so thick that noon felt like twilight. They worked in isolated camps, small islands of flickering light in an ocean of darkness, driven by the promise of wealth. But this land held memories of winters so brutal they could erase a camp from existence, leaving only silence and snow-covered tombs. It was a place that rewarded grit, but punished the slightest mistake with absolute finality. Hartwell's disappearance was the first ripple in a pond of unease. It was followed weeks later by that of the Morrison brothers, twins known for their brute strength. Their abandoned cart held a half-eaten lunch and a sweet, cloying odor of decay that clung to the air, a scent that defied the clean smell of pine. Then the whispers began among the loggers and trappers of strange smokes in uninhabited valleys, of crude shelters built from bark and bone, and of strange, bare footprints in the mud, with toes too long and a gait that sometimes fell to all fours. The fear solidified when Constable William Hayes, the sole figure of law and logic in the town of Maple Ridge, vanished from his own locked cabin. Hayes was a man who believed in patterns, in evidence, in a rational order to the world. But the events of the past weeks defied all logic. He was a man of the law, confronting something lawless. On the night he disappeared, he left behind a half-written report to the territorial governor, a pot of still-warm coffee, and a door swinging open to the night. His disappearance was an act of contemptuous audacity. It told the 237 souls of Maple Ridge that their laws and their locks were meaningless. The monster was no longer just in the woods. It was at their doors. Panic, cold and sharp, forced an emergency meeting in the town's Lutheran church. The air was thick with the scent of fear as arguments erupted, fracturing the community's fragile unity. "We must send word to Detroit," declared Margaret Olson, the school mom, her voice tight with desperation. "The territorial militia must be summoned." "Detroit is a 4-day ride by horseback, Margaret, assuming the rider even makes it," retorted Samuel Brennan, the town blacksmith, his voice a low rumble of pragmatic despair. "We are on our own." This exchange captured the essence of their terror. They were isolated, trapped, and utterly alone. It was into this chaos that Dr. Nathaniel Foster, the town's physician, stepped forward. A man of science amidst rising superstition, he brought not speculation, but evidence from his medical bag. He produced an object wrapped in linen. As he unwrapped it, a collective gasp of horror filled the church. It was a tool, sharpened to a point, carved from a human femur. Along its polished shaft were 37 notches, a tally. The room fell silent as the implications settled over them. They were not victims of a random beast, but prey for a systematic hunter. Foster's final revelation sealed their terror. He spoke of human bite marks found on trees near the Morrison camp, impressions showing a jaw far too wide to be normal, and teeth that had been filed to sharp, unnatural points. As this horrifying truth paralyzed the congregation, the church doors burst open, not with an attack, but with the arrival of a ghost, Jacob Winters. A trapper, presumed dead for weeks, stumbled into the town square, a skeletal figure in bloody rags. He was living, irrefutable proof. His body a roadmap of the horrors he had endured. "They kept me," he rasped, his eyes hollowed by things a mind was never meant to see. "They're not people anymore." He pointed a trembling finger to the tree line, where pale shapes could now be seen moving in the shadows. "They're coming. Tonight." Inside Dr. Foster's clinic, as the town outside frantically boarded its windows, Winters laid the full, terrible truth bare. His story was a descent into madness, a testament to the fragility of the human soul. He spoke of the Murdoch clan, a family of loggers lost in the great blizzard of 1848. Trapped for months in the crushing cold and darkness, facing starvation, they had turned on each other to survive, crossing the ultimate taboo. "It gets easier, you see," Winters whispered, his voice a dead monotone. "Once you've crossed that line once, crossing it again is like stepping over a crack in the dirt." But the act had not just saved them, it had irrevocably changed them, breaking something deep within their humanity. Led by the eldest son, Caleb, and his sister Ruth, they embraced their new nature, retreating into the forest's deepest shadows. Their hunger was no longer for survival, but for power. It had become a driving philosophy, a new and terrible religion. They began to hunt, their family growing with each person they took. Each strong survivor they broke and remade in their own image. "They don't just kill," Winters whispered as the first sound, a claw scraping across the roof, echoed from above. "They recruit." The attack was swift and brutally intelligent. A pale face with filed teeth appeared at the back window, a horrifying distraction. A moment later, the front door exploded inward. They were being herded like animals. Fleeing through a hidden cellar tunnel, Foster, Cray, and Winters emerged in the church basement, only to become unwilling witnesses to the fall of their town. Their hiding place a dark theater box to an apocalyptic play. The square outside was a stage lit by strategic fires. The Murdoch clan moved with the efficiency of wolves, culling the weak and binding the strong. The town's redefinition from a community to a larder was completed when a young boy, Timothy Morrison, walked calmly out of the crowd and surrendered himself to Ruth, whispering that it was better than waiting. The town's will to resist was broken, as Ruth gave the order to take the rest. The screaming began. It lasted 17 minutes. From their hiding place, the three survivors watched the aftermath. Dr. Foster, his hand shaking, tried to document the horror in his notebook. His role shifting from physician to the last historian of a dead town. He noted how the dead were sorted, how the captured were dragged towards the woods, and most chillingly, how the children were gathered in the center of the square. Unharmed but vacant-eyed, they sat in a silent circle. When Ruth began to sing a twisted, profane version of a familiar hymn, the children joined her, their pure voices a chilling testament to their capture. It was not just a massacre, it was an indoctrination. The survivors knew they had to escape. The creatures were searching the church above, their footsteps drawing closer, their guttural voices echoing through the floorboards. As they fled down the dark, claustrophobic drainage tunnel, sounds of destruction came from both ends, the church behind them and the clinic ahead. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and their own ragged, panicked breaths. They were trapped. It was in that final desperate moment that Mayor Cray, the symbol of a failed civilization, withdrew his small derringer. "If they find us," he said quietly, his voice hollow, "we do not let them take us alive." Official records state that Maple Ridge was abandoned, its fate a minor mystery lost to time. But its true history survived in whispers, a chilling local legend. The story of the Murdoch clan is not merely one of monsters, but a harrowing warning about the thin veneer of civilization. It reminds us that when pushed to the absolute brink, when the hunger is deep enough, the line between survivor and monster can be terrifyingly, irrevocably crossed.